Helping you become your own favorite watercolor artist is the point of this channel and my watercolor mission. I'm here to help you with watercolor techniques and tips, and today we're going to be painting a sign of spring using some wet and wet watercolor techniques. This lesson is going to be really helpful if you're struggling to master water balance in watercolor and keep those blooms from taking over your painting. So grab your watercolor supplies, hit subscribe on the video, that'll help you find it later if we get interrupted, and let's get started painting. We're going to paint some Pussywillows, and we're going to try to keep it pretty, I shouldn't say realistic because I'm always a loose painter, but we're going to try to keep it pretty soft and loose while still sticking to the original look and feel of Pussywillows. I've actually done two additional versions of this painting. I did this one, which has a lot of beautiful shimmer that you're not going to see. And as you can see, the Pussywillows are very soft and subtle indeed. I might be playing with that a bit more. And then this one, which I think is really close to what I like to communicate in my paintings, soft and loose, a little hint of the Pussywillow while still leaving it open-ended so that it could be almost anything else. That's just my way of sharing my world in a gentle and subtle way. Plus having a lot of fun with watercolor. And if you're interested in either of these lessons, I can share those with you in the description below the video. For now though, we're going to try to stay fairly literal and paint our Pussywillows, getting a nice soft look in watercolor, which can be a lot of fun. So first of all, let's just take a look at these plants, buds. In our region, this is the very first sign of spring that you see, and they might be for a lot of regions, I don't know. I love the graceful stem. We've got this arc of a branch. And depending on what kind of willow you have, there's different shaped branches as well. We have some that are a lot more bendy, but I like these long straight ones. We have, of course, the fuzzy seed head, which in just a few days it gets pollen and gets looking kind of ugly as it grows further and then progresses into a cluster of leaves. And then we have the little husk of the bud that the Pussywillows popped out of, this darker kind of teardrop shape. I like the willow branches as well for their kind of reddish color. They're kind of a reddish violet, which I think is really beautiful. And some of these as well, we're just using our powers of observation before we start to paint. If we want to get the feel for something, we need to kind of get into its head, which is a funny thing to say, but we wanted to really be thinking about and focused on what are the subject of our painting. So this branch actually has Pussywillows, but it also has these little buds that didn't turn into Pussywillows or haven't yet. So it's got these little nubbins on the edges, which give it some more shape. So we'll keep that in mind as we paint as well. I don't have to paint exactly those Pussywillows to get a realistic look. So we're going to just start with a nice line of column of twig, and I want a reddish violet color, so I'm going to choose a Perylene red, and then I had a little bit of violet in my palette, and that's just a little too red. I need it to be a little browner. So when we want to tone down a red, best place to go is to a green. We'll just add a hint of a green, and that just dirties up that red enough so that it gets neutralized. So now we have a really nice kind of violet, red, brown to use for our first branch. And hey, I like that. Okay, now I do want to have a background in this painting, and I need to start thinking about it now. It's a mistake to wait too long to paint your background. So let's put in some of this. I like this kind of violet color, but I also like this, it's called Wisteria actually, but I also like this lavender from Daniel Smith. I think it has a soft look that works really well for spring, so we're going to throw that down. And putting a lot of color right now on the paper means I'm going to be working wet and wet in just a minute. Okay, so we're just going to spread out our background And this twig is our guide. It tells us what we're going to be doing, but a lot of it's going to disappear as I start to add this soft fluidity for our background. And we can do this painting in one step, where we do everything wet and have a lot of softness, or we can let it dry and come back and add the details if you want a more realistic look. But adding this very soft pale background now makes our job easier because we don't have to paint around complex or objects that are intended to be soft and fuzzy like our Pussywillows. It gets very hard to do that once your objects have dried. Add a little more wisteria here and there. Just such a spring-like color. Probably because it makes me think of crocuses, which are our second sign of spring around here. Now look at how, even though I've added a lot of water and color, I still have that original stem that I painted. I left some space where I have dry paper. And then because I painted it first and then kind of paused, it got a chance to kind of stain into the paper as well. If I were to try to paint more on that twig right now, let's just try that. This brush is really thirsty and it just drank up all my color that was right here. Let's add some more red to that. See if we can't mix up a little bit more. So if I were to try to paint my twig now, guess what else is going to be soft and fuzzy? But because I painted it first, I had this nice dry, I had some nice crisp lines where the paint hit the dry paper. So, so here we have one twig, and I'm only going to paint one today. We're going to keep it simple. So we're going to paint our little husks right now and just kind of create placement for our Pussywillows, where they're going to go. Something like that. By working with a lot of softness at this stage, we actually create opportunities for some flexibility. If we don't like what's happening on the paper, it's a lot easier to erase or camouflage a soft line than a hard and crisp one. And right now I'm using that same twig color to create some soft, diffused twigs that can be background for our painting. Okay, now I want to try working with some gray. And I have some grays, the brand new grays from Daniel Smith. I'm only going to try one of them today. I'll try to share a video with some thoughts on the new grays sometime in the future. But for now, we're just going to play with one. And I just kind of picked it at random here. It's Alvaro's Fresco Gray. It's a very cool gray. It looks blue actually when I put it onto my plate here, as you can see. It looks really blue. So let's just put a dot of that Fresco Gray right here and right here. And suddenly I have very dark Pussywillows. Too dark, but we're going to work with them. We're going to nurture them a bit in just a second here. We'll get another one here, another one here, one here. As I have less paint on my brush with each stroke, the color gets lighter. And there's less moisture on my brush as well, so it's softer and more diffused. We'll put some in the background there. Some really small ones with some spatter. Okay, so now we have Pussywillows, but they're the wrong color. But that's okay because we're going to now work with, see if we can't lift out a little bit of shape here. And whenever you lift out, you remove moisture and color from the paper. And so when I go back in just a second, I'm going to have less moisture in those areas because I blotted with my tissue. And so now I'm going to grab some of my original background color, the lavender. Let's just see if we can't tease out a Pussywillow shape by painting right up to that gray. And this is kind of, I have to say, this is a little bit of an advanced technique because you're working with multiple levels of moisture on your paper. You're working with a very dry, or not a very dry, but a drying area where you lifted out color around the shape of the Pussywillow. And then the area of the background is still quite damp. And so you have a lot of flow there. And so being able to judge how much water to add to the paper at this stage is a bit of a learning curve. And what better way to learn than by giving this demonstration a try? So we're just going to introduce some wisteria in here. We're going to let a little bit of it flow. We're going to go up here before we run out of time because, you know, everything's in the process of drying. And your climate's going to be a factor in this as well. This looks like a cotton ball or something. It's not quite the shape I want it to have. That's a little better. But if you want to have a fuzzy looking plant, you have to do some work, the wet and wet. You have to work while things are soft. And this edge looks a little bit crisp, so I worry it a little bit with my brush just to soften it out. I'm still losing this shape here, which is not pleasing me. I want a Pussywillow there. That's better. Lifted a little bit more moisture. And then I'm going to darken around it a little bit to give me some contrast between values. And the Pussywillows actually are a little darker in the center, so we'll do that as well. We'll remember that they do have darker values inside of their shapes. But right now we're just focused on working those outer edges and getting that the way we want it. I'm going to add some more of that fresco gray, this time to the outer part of the Pussywillow, and I'm going to blot some more of this. This guy needs to be a little bit lighter. So there's a back and forth here as I create the shape I want by painting around it and by lifting out. And a little hint of that fresco gray is on my brush right now, so I'm just pulling it into my background as well to make my painting interesting. Okay, so we are getting some Pussywillows coming to life. They're very soft. They don't really dominate the painting. We're keeping it simple today, but if I were doing this in my own time, not for video, I'd probably be working to be a little more complex, having several twigs and, you know, more clusters of Pussywillows, just to up the complexity and make the painting a little more interesting. We could maybe hint at one right up here, just again with the negative painting. And look at how that line stays because everything's starting to dry. We have to go back and forth with a damp brush to soften and blend. This is not the only way to paint something. I love that there are so many ways to create illusion and effect in watercolor. Everything we paint is always just a symbol of the object it represents. So that means we have some freedom to how we want to represent it. And that one has softness, and yet it's very clearly contoured as well, which works quite well. Some of these have gotten smaller than I probably would have liked. I just keep going back and forth, lifting a little bit. You can lift with your brush as well, a thirsty brush. Can lift color just like a sponge. There's some really beautiful colors mingling in the background here. Okay, we're gonna take a tiny brush right now and see if we can't do a little bit of that inside work. I'm gonna keep my brush quite dry, more paint than water on the brush, and that will give me a little more control with the colors I place. I'm gonna go in with just some stronger darks in here to give our Pussywillows that contour. And if there's some drying areas, then I'll get a little bit of line in here as well. This will give them depth and form. And then right where it touches the branch, you're going to see more dark shadows as well. Put that little dark shadow shape in and then soften and lift, working really to be subtle here. Our eyes are incredibly capable of seeing very subtle changes in value. And that just brings me back to being really observant. Really wanting to work to see this is that little seed husk. Maybe another one here. And everything's quite damp, so that little husk is going to be kind of soft and diffused as well, which I actually think is a good thing. Okay, so this is still very soft, and I talk about being realistic, but I'm always going to be a loose painter at heart. We're going to continue painting in just a moment, but before we do that, I just want to interrupt you for a message from our sponsor. That would be me, just to let you know that you can find links to all the supplies that we've used in the video today down in the description below the video. As I mentioned earlier, I have 2 other Pussywillow lessons that I'm not sharing here on YouTube, but I am making available for free for anyone who wants to sign up for those. What I found was that when I started painting Pussywillows, I actually needed 3 different variations, 3 different attempts to get me a little closer to what I wanted to say in my paintings. And this often happens when you're trying to be a loose and intuitive painter. You need to spend some time digging a little deeper so that you can figure out how to paint what you want to paint in your way. I want to show you those because they're a little less representational of Pussywillows. They're a lot more getting to the heart of what I wanted to say rather than actually just showing you what something looks like. A competent painter can show others what an object might look like, but a heart-led painter is going to get a little closer to the feeling of the experience of being in that place or that time of year or that memory. And that's really where I want to go with my loose and intuitive paintings. Even if you're a realistic painter, learning a little bit about intuitive painting techniques can help you put more expression in your paintings and show a little more of your heart in what you do. If you haven't hit subscribe already, please do so. As my subscribers grow, I'm able to offer more content for students here on YouTube. I have a lot of great content here on YouTube, a lot of hours of lessons that you can learn from. However, there is content that you're not getting if you're not already on my mailing list. Every week I send out encouragement for artists, tips and tutorials, links to new courses and lessons, and a lot of that content is free, but only available to subscribers. So if you haven't subscribed already, I've put a link down in the description below the video for you to do that. You can start with my Fearless Artist series, which will help you start thinking about mindset issues, things that hold you back from painting from your heart, and help you paint more fearlessly. And then from there, we move you into the weekly subscriber series where you benefit from weekly content that's curated to encourage you and inspire you and teach you so that you can become a masterful watercolor painter in all respects, not just technically, but from your heart as well. Let's go back and add some detail to our Pussywillows. We want to create some form by adding those further levels of detail. Every time I come back to the painting, I'm able to add a little more detail. However, I also increase my likelihood of the odds that I might make a mistake. And so if you're struggling with overworking your paintings, holding back a little bit and pausing before you go into those next details, really ask yourself, what does the painting need? And that will help you to avoid those overworking mistakes that we often create. So it's not totally dry, but it's dry enough that I can go in and start adding more detail. And this is where a loose painting begins to become more realistic. If you have a good foundation, you can keep building up and adding detail until you get the level of realism that you're looking for. Personally, I really like a soft and loose painting, so I don't spend a lot of time adding detail. I like the open-ended feel of a looser painting, but if you want to add more detail, this is where we wait for it to dry, think about what goes next. As you spend time planning, the painting will grow stronger because you're going in with some intentions, knowing what to do. And you can see I've sized my brush way down. I actually should have a more in-between size, but I'm just going to paint. I'm not going to look for it right now. But the smaller your brush, the more detailed you're going to feel like being. But you can see just by sharpening that line, making that line crisper for my twig here, it gives me a stronger, more realistic feel to my painting. That's still fairly damp. I might get a fuzzy edge there, so I'll need to keep an eye on it to make sure it doesn't fuzz out too much. This Pussywillow clearly got a little off track. It's bent way out, and usually they cling a little closer to the branch, but I think it still works. That's one thing I like about painting nature, is that it's not perfect. Things get distorted, things get nibbled on by bugs, and little hints of, oh, that's not working. I was going to add a little bit of red to warm up my twig. Oh, maybe it is. I like it actually. Make it a little more interesting by adding pops of those original colors, those pure colors that I mixed in. It'd be really pretty. Just by adding those crisp edges, we give points of reference to help the viewer understand what they're looking at. Remember that we can keep it subtle. I think a lot of times paintings get overworked because the artist is a little too heavy-handed. And let's just experiment with adding some little fuzzy bits on the outer part of the flower or the bud. See what that adds to the painting. You can see I've added just tiny little lines there, and then I'm going to soften on this side and see if that accentuates the fuzziness. Okay, so just take a look at how adding those little lines just made that pop just a little bit more. That was really fun. So let's try it on this side. Little tiny lines with the tiny brush, and you can see that's very stiff. Contours and finishes off that shape and looks like a little punk rock. And then we grab some water and we erase most of it. And that one worked as not quite as well. Maybe because the colors I used were just a little bit darker. Let's soften even more. And let's try the lavender again. Poking it in. And because I softened and added water there, it's actually creeping inside just a little bit more than I want it to, and that's where you got to go back and blot. So you do and you undo. And this is where paintings can start to look overworked. So this is something you want to be careful with, because lifting is fun, lifting is effective, lifting helps us fix mistakes and have a little more control over our painting, but it can really start to make your painting look forced once that paper starts to get a little tired. Paper that's wet is more fragile than dry paper, and so as we wet and re-wet it, we can start to disturb the nap of the paper. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but the tooth of the paper really gets kind of beat up and fussed over, and that's when we start to lose that freshness, that transparency, because you can't restore tired paper. It just stays tired. Kind of like me when my kids were toddlers. It's pretty tired. So I'm adding a little more line in this one too, just experimenting. Line, and then I'm going to soften a little bit of that line and lift a tiny bit, and that just gives me kind of a lost and found edge, softness and crispness. This is working. Tiny little details that make a difference. Let's just move up here. Now up here we have really soft, very little contrast in that area. So, and I want to keep it that way. So we're going to add some of the line to contour and then bleed it away again and try to make it almost invisible. Suddenly we have shapes, we have forms taking shape in the mist. Well, not in the mist, but you get the idea. Going darker on this side, we're going to see if we can get away with that. Darker over here, and then bleed that out. When you're bleeding out darker colors, you need to give them more room to bleed, to fade away to nothing, because there's more of them to fade. This one has a bit of an edge here. And this almost could be a second Pussywillow, kind of behind the first one. We're not gonna analyze it. We're just gonna give it some spikes, shave them off. I'm actually gonna add a shadow in here. And that, as it dries, I think will give us that feeling of maybe two little buds clustered up against each other. So we paint and erase and we create that as well. Now, a couple more things just before we call this done. Again, you can add as much or as little detail as you want. It's your painting and you decide when it's finished. But I'm going to add just, knowing that adding a secondary shadow in some of our darker areas will add more dimension. So I can actually add a little bit of line and darkness to these little hulls. And that will actually give them a little more personality, a little more depth to help them look more realistic. And I like the little hints of red in there. Actually, that was a good thing. So that would be another place to go if I needed to add further complexity and depth to my painting. So I'm going to call that finished. I'm really pleased with my whole foray into spring, into playing with these Pussywillows. It's a way of getting in touch with spring and enjoying the beauty of spring. It's a subtle beauty because there's no greenery out yet. It's very subdued and neutral. But when you start to look at your environment with an artist's eye, you see that there is beauty everywhere. And I think that's the thing that I love the most about painting, is the way it has helped me to connect with the world. Remember that I have more lessons on painting pussy willows in much more intuitive and loose ways. You are welcome to check those out. I've added links at the bottom of this video to guide you over to those. And whatever your exploration, remember that it is your painting. And when you paint from your heart, you get to be your own favorite artist.